Good morning. It's good to see you all today. If we haven't met before, my name is Colin. I'm the pastor here at Branches, and it's just a joy to be with you in this Advent season. And thank you for Mabola for leading us in hearing about Moses today and lighting our second candle as we continue to prepare our hearts for Christmas Eve together. So again, just want to welcome you here, especially if it's your first time here. Thanks for being here. I'd love to get a chance to meet you. If you leave, as you leave today out in the lobby, it'd be great just to shake your hand and get your name and welcome you here to Branches. In that spirit, if you would, please check in. Let us know that you're here today. There's a QR code on the screen. There's QR codes on these cards in front of you and the seat backs in front of you. You can scan and let us know you're here. There's also a Next Steps card you can scan, kind of see everything that's coming up and other opportunities for you to get plugged in, make community here, connect with some other folks here at Branches. We hope that you'll do that today and let us know you're here. Love to welcome you, get you on the email list, and just thank you for being with us in worship today. As you heard in our Advent candle lighting and saw in our video and seeing these beautiful graphics that Marcel has made, we're in a series called Icons. And last week we kind of laid the groundwork for this series to say, like, an icon is somebody who represents something, a physical image, an example, a posture, a disposition. We see a picture, maybe think about seeing a picture of a relative that's passed away or someone you really admire, maybe it hangs in your office. And just seeing the picture brings to mind all of their positive qualities and their virtues and their larger than life kind of presence in your life and the stories about them that make them who they are, and maybe the stories you've told about them at their memorial or the stories you tell them about them so you can help someone else get to know them. An icon is somebody who kind of stands in the way of a certain posture and position. This is an icon. This is a person who represents something for me, or represents something for this community, or represents something for humanity even. And so we're talking about these icons in the Bible and how they lead up to what we would say in Christian theology is Jesus is the icon of God. He is the epitome of who God is. He's the living, breathing, fleshly example of God in the world. It wasn't just like a mouthpiece for God or somebody who kind of knew God, but Christians have been saying for 2,000 years that God came in the flesh, in history, in this person, Jesus of Nazareth, an icon, a center point, an anchor, a cornerstone of the faith. This is God in the flesh. And so leading all up to that, we talked about Abraham last week, we're talking about Moses today, and how they represent kind of signposts along the way to this culmination in the person of Jesus. We talked a little bit last week and kind of called out in a participatory way people who are icons for us. And often it's celebrities. For me, like, I'm a big movie guy. I'm Wicked pilled. I saw Wicked over the weekend. Great, love it. It's awesome. You should go see it. And a lot of icons for me are movie stars. I'm distraught and saddened that the Regal Edwards down the street is going to paint over that beautiful mural in the lobby with all the movie stars on it, depicting a moment in time when Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman were still together and love was still alive in the world, you know. So they're going to paint over. It's going to be a beautiful renovation, I'm sure. But like those sorts of, like the movie theater in my small hometown, when they did that, they got rid of all these portraits of these Hollywood actors from the past. It was awful for me. It was like, now just as like a modern box, like with no pictures in it, you know? And so for me, really, a lot of times, icons for me are movie stars. I love the movies. I used to go to the movies every Friday. You know, Friday's my day off, and so I'd go for a matinee. It's wonderful. It's like me and like one other person in there watching a movie together. I didn't even care if the movie was bad. It was just great for me. I love the movies. Loved going to the movies. 2013, a movie came out. You may have seen it. It was a hit, kind of, but it wasn't huge. People don't really remember it. It wasn't like Oscar-worthy by any means, but it had some great actors in it called Now You See Me. Anybody see Now You See Me? Jesse Eisenberg, Isla Fisher, one of the Francos, you know, Mark Ruffalo, big fan of him, Morgan Freeman, of course. And Dan Harmon, somebody I really admire, he talks about this. He's like, the premise of this is like, what if magicians were cool, you know? What if Ocean's 11 were magicians and not just like criminals or whatever? And so that's kind of the premise of the movie, this kind of heist movie. It's a great airplane movie. Like, you don't care if the announcement comes on and the audio's messed up or you can barely hear it or whatever. Like, it's fun. It's good popcorn fun. You wouldn't think, like, it was an okay movie. It was fine. Like, I'd watch it again if it came on television or if it was on streaming and I was like wanting to watch something maybe to like fall asleep to or something. It's fine. There are other Jesse Eisenberg movies I would watch. But it was a big enough hit that the producers were like, we got to cash in on this. Magicians are cool. So before we show the next slide, I just want to ask, if you were to title the sequel of this movie, what would you call it? Now you don't. It's so obvious. It's so dumb. Dan Harmon talks about this. He shares the rage and ire that I have for this. He's like, he saw the marquee for this movie, like outside, like walking by, and it said, "Now You See Me Too." And he was like, oh, they're showing that movie from 2013 at 2 p.m. Like, that's what he thought it was saying. But no, baked into the title, "Now You See Me," is this like expectation that now you don't, you know? And so the sequel, you get all these like big wigs in a room and these kind of producers, and they're like, I think we're gonna make a sequel. I can't wait for "Now You See Me Too." Just saying it out loud. I thought about this all week. It's just like, I'm gonna feel the rage inside me, and I'm gonna channel that into preaching the gospel on Sunday morning. It's so obvious. And it's just a shining example for me about like how something so clear, something so apparent, I can't look at it anymore. Would you please put it down? Is so obvious that it's so silly that that's not the title they chose. That they didn't call it "Now You Don't." I have never seen the sequel. I refuse. I will never watch it. It's so obvious that that's what it should have been. And it's just like, again, a shining example of how humans, even when it's so clear, even when it's so before us, even when it's so obvious, like that we miss the big picture. That there was no plan. If there was a sequel, we'd call it this. There was no plan. They're like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's going to make a lot of sense for us to do that. Maybe they thought like people won't know it's a sequel to this other movie. I don't know, silliness. But again, I think it enrages me because we've all been in this position before. It's like, oh, it was so obvious, and maybe about ourselves. Why didn't I say that? Or why didn't I do that? Or like you have those imaginary arguments with your boss or your coworker or your friend or your spouse or your family member. And you're like, I should have said this. It was so obvious. It was right there. That would have been great. We miss the bigger picture. We miss the obvious thing. We miss the thing that it should be most of the time when it's too late. John Mark Comer tells a story of his son Moses. When his son Moses is like a teenager now, but he was really, really little. He came to his dad as, as a pastor and an author. He's very busy, and John Mark Comer's kind of neat and orderly, kind of type A person. And Moses came to him, and at the time, Moses couldn't say his R's. It was very cute. And so he said, "Daddy, will you wrestle with me?" And John Mark is like, no, Mose, I'm busy. I can't wrestle with you right now. I can't. And kind of like missing what was happening, this like opportunity for connection. And so Moses says, "Daddy, if I kiss you, will you wrestle with me?" And I'm reading this in John Mark's book, God Has a Name. It was like very touching to me. Like John Mark realizes this moment for compassion and connection with his son. And he kind of beats himself up about it in the book. He's like, I missed it in that moment. I was like ready to disappoint my son's kind of bid for my connection. I missed it. It was obvious. It was as obvious as titling this movie, "Now You Don't." It's as obvious as something just right in front of your face. It's as obvious like for the disciples who have Jesus in front of them telling them like, this is what we're going to do. This is what I'm going to do. This is how it's all going to come to pass. And then when it happens, they're like, wow, that's weird. I didn't think that was going to happen. We miss the obvious things so often. And part of, I think, the spiritual life of Christian discipleship, of spiritual formation, is forming our eyes, is kind of clearing up our perception so we don't miss it. So we don't miss the opportunity for charity. So we don't miss the opportunity for human connection and community. So we don't miss then the next step that God is putting before us as a community or individually or as a family, that God is inviting us to do something. And part of our formation is to be aware and to kind of open our eyes, to clean off the antennas, as it were, so that we can notice those things when they happen and not when it's too late. Moses, like Abraham, was not perfect. Moses, like Abraham, had his own shortcomings, his own mistakes. If you read the Exodus story and onward, you see him have great victories and successes and great failures. And that's where we find the author of Hebrews talking about Moses. If you've never read the book of Hebrews before, it's not an easy read, I would say. It's not a place when people say, like, what is the first book of the Bible I should read if I'm reading the Bible? I would never say Hebrews. But it's so rich and powerful and beautiful. And I'll give you kind of what I think the major premise of the book of Hebrews is. The author of the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, after Jesus is resurrected, he's saying to this Jewish community of Christians, remember Abraham? Yeah, wasn't Abraham great? And Remember Moses, wasn't he great, kind of recounting some of his story? Remember the prophets, and remember David, kind of all these people in their history, in their story, in their past. Remember all of them, all the great things about him? Jesus is even better. All the things you admire about these icons, Moses, Abraham, David, the prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, all of them are great. Jesus is better. He's the culmination of all those things, the perfect embodiment of all those things. And that's what he's talking about today in Hebrews chapter 3 and the person of Moses. So this is what it says. Therefore, brothers and sisters, holy partners in a heavenly calling, consider that Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. Yet Jesus is worthy of more glory than Moses, just as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, to testify to the things that would be spoken later. Christ, however, was faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house if we hold firm the confidence and the pride that belong to hope. Friends, this is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Moses was faithful. We talked about faithfulness last week in Abraham's story. But Moses was faithful, it says in particular in 3:5, Moses was faithful as a servant. Maybe your background of Moses' story isn't necessarily the Exodus story. Maybe it's Prince of Egypt. Not a bad place to start. Recommend it. Catchy music, wonderful. Not exactly accurate. It kind of makes him better than he actually is. But in Moses' story, over and over and over again, Moses is kind of tenuously connected, like, okay, God, I'll do what you want, just like Abraham. And when he latches himself to God, when he trusts God, when he walks alongside God and lets God do what God's going to do, these amazing things happen. The sea is parted and water comes out of a rock, and the law and instruction for this community comes, and they eventually make it out of the desert, and they're provided for with manna and food in the desert. Moses, in varying degree, is faithful. But what Hebrews says in particular is that Moses is faithful as a servant. The word servant here is connected to a verb, therapon. You can already hear etymology and the kind of connection here to our English word therapy. And it has a similar connotation. The therapon, most of the time in the New Testament, is translated as to cure or to heal, or sometimes, rarely, but sometimes to minister to. So the most frequent translation of therapon is when Jesus heals a person. Or when the apostles, after Jesus is resurrected and he leaves this group of people behind, when they do healing, they therapon people. That's how they do it. That's the verb that's used. And so it's essentially saying that Moses was a faithful person to the work of healing and curing and ministering to and transforming the lives of the Israelites. He kind of oversaw this house that God had built, and that was the task that he had been given. To be faithful to the curative work of keeping this wily group of people together. To do the curative work of providing them guidance through the law. To do the curative work of giving them something to eat in the desert. To do the curative work of leading them to the thing that God had promised them. And Hebrews says that curative work, that therapon work, that healing, curing work that Moses did is something that God had done all along through history, and he's chosen people along the way to do that, and it culminates, of course, again, in Jesus. But even Jesus, the one that we worship as God if we follow Jesus, the one that embodies God in the flesh, even he was a servant. He gave himself to something bigger than himself. He made what wasn't maybe so obvious, but should be obvious to others, so obvious to people that follow him. The work of people that follow him is to be a companion like Moses was, to give food to the hungry, to care for the sick, to befriend the lonely, to be in a community with other people who aren't like you, to take the long, obedient road in one direction and not the quick fix, to be a loving, caring, compassionate person. All of this embodied in Jesus. That's the iconographic center of Moses' life that then is culminated in Jesus' life. one who delivers people from bondage, one who sets people free, one who cures and fixes and transforms and mends the wounds of people who are hurting. Moses was faithful to that. He was a servant to that bigger goal of what God is trying to do that we read. If we read all the way to the end of the Bible, is the ultimate thing that God is trying to do, to reconcile, to put all things back together in himself. Signpost along the way, Hebrews says, and all these figures of Israel's past culminated in Jesus as a person and then fulfilled ultimately. That's our hope in the future. Paired though with that in Hebrews' kind of picture of that, this grand scope of history and story, is then an imperative, a command, an instruction given. That just as Moses gave himself in faithfulness as a servant, and just as Jesus took on the form of a servant, Philippians says, people that follow Jesus then take on faithfully the form of a servant. The form of something that serves something bigger than ourselves. That gives ourselves to a vision that doesn't belong to us. That give ourselves to something that we couldn't come up with on our own, nor could we complete or even do some small task of on our own. But to give ourselves to the hard, long, obedient work of caring for the sick, of lifting up the lowly, of keeping our eye on the oppressed, of loving when it's hard to love, and seeking reconciliation in relationship and human connection. I joke with myself sometimes that I could have a sermon illustration from the human interest stories of CBS Sunday Morning every Sunday. And they come up on my TikTok and these TikTok accounts that are, they call them Hope Core, where it's there's all this other bad stuff in the world. How about a really touching story that will make you cry? And rather, you can go watch the video on your own because I'm afraid of my emotional reaction. And showing you the video, so I'll just tell you the story from my account. There's a small town in Missouri that had a new elementary school, and they wanted to name the elementary school. So they go through this kind of voting process with the school board, and then openly with the community. Is it MLK Elementary School, or is it named after one of the presidents, or maybe a famous Missourian of the past, or maybe some other figure, maybe a principal who's passed away, or some star teacher or whatever. And then they got all the votes, and it was overwhelming who they voted for. And so there's a really great picture here of this school and this community. They named the school Claudine Wilson Learning Center. That's Claudine in the middle in the gray shirt. You can her head kind of tilted with this sly smile on her face. Claudine is the decades-long faithfulness custodian of the elementary school. And the heart-wrenching part of watching the story, it's not heart-wrenching because it's sad, it's so beautiful, is they interview the students, the kids at the school, and they're like, when we get sick, we don't go to the nurse, we go to Claudine. Or we're having a hard day, we need some advice, we don't go to one of our teachers, one of our peers, we go to Claudine. She does the landscaping, she drives the bus, she cleans the school, she's the listening ear for the teachers and the parents and the kids, and so they voted overwhelmingly to name their school after her. Of course, sweet Claudine in Missouri, when asked about it, she's like, I don't deserve this. They should have named it after somebody else. So the guy on CBS Sunday Morning is like, so we'll add humility to one of your qualities, It was very, very touching. When they asked her, why do you think this happened? Why do you think this is? She was like, it's about the kids. And she said, I have the kids in my heart. That it wasn't about cleaning the floors and making sure she did her tasks. She's like, I get there 6 a.m. and I get home at 7 p.m. She's dedicated her life in work and posture and disposition toward the children. Her work isn't the custodial work. Her custodial work is to the end of having an environment that kids want to be in and care about and be cared for and loved and seen. That's somebody who was a faithful servant to something bigger than herself. And then is emblazoned and honored for forever on the name of this school. That's the task of people that follow Jesus, is to give ourselves to something bigger. And this kind of, honestly, it kind of flies in the face and combats with some message that we're often told is make yourself big. There's a great moment in Ted Lasso where the owner of the team is she does this practice to make herself really big, and she has this really reflective moment where she sees a child version of herself and sees herself really big before she goes to this meeting with all these men owners, and she really wants to show up. There's nothing wrong with that. But we make ourselves big for something else. not for ourselves, not for our own wants or desires, not for our own path that we want to carve for ourselves, not for our own success or our own well-being, or so that we got our name put on some building, though that's great. We give ourselves as a faithful servant to something bigger than ourselves. We watch this bumper video every week during the series. People here at St. Luke's and some other places, at Babita's and over at PX Project, of doing what we would just consider like normal stuff. Rachel walking around with her papers, pretending to work in children's ministry or whatever. I'm just kidding. I say that out of love for Rachel. Nick doing his like really hands-on, beautiful woodworking. Somebody over at PX Project baking. The barista over at Babita's, when they're making your drink, when you're there kind of running in and out, you wouldn't even notice. Our work becomes beautiful, Christ-centered work. Our work becomes servanthood and apprenticeship and faithfulness when it serves something else, not just itself. The things we think are mundane and unimportant and menial and just kind of small and over there become beautiful pieces of this work that God is doing to show who he is and that we can show the world who he is. In Advent, we're kind of putting those pieces together to, on Christmas Eve, kind of look fully at this beautiful, wonderful, weird, transformative thing that God has done to come to be with us in the person of Jesus. And challenge for us and challenge for our community and challenge for our city and the neighbors and our families and the people we know and us individually is to make the obvious obvious. Like it's before us to love our neighbors and care for others and to give ourselves in companionship as Moses did and to be people of love and to do all that. It's, of course, easier said than done. But the first step, the kind of threshold that we step through is say, today's not going to be about me and what I want. My work is not going to be about me and what I want. It's to be other-oriented and to be oriented for something bigger than ourselves. I think when we can look in history of communities that did this, that weren't insular, that didn't think about themselves, but thought about being part of something bigger, those are the ones we remember. And those standout people in those communities, like those are the ones we remember that could have, they didn't need any recognition. They could have given themselves, like Claudine, the rest of their life to something bigger than themselves. And that would have been beautiful and good. An icon, and somebody that stands out for us as someone who gives themselves to something bigger than themselves. Even one who deserved all the acclaim and all the glory and all the worthiness, as we sang today, Jesus took on the form of a servant, poured himself out, gave of himself totally in a weird way to something bigger than himself, which is to reconcile the world to himself. And thanks be to God for that. Let's pray. God, we thank you that you've given yourself radically in a new way, in a beautiful way, in your Son, Jesus. And we ask that you would help us give ourselves to that cause, give ourselves to his person, give ourselves to his love, so that when others see us and see how we work and see what we say and see what we do, they see something bigger and greater than us. Give us hearts of servanthood, of faithfulness. Give us hearts of love and humility and compassion. Make us part of what you're doing, not of what we want or what we desire or what we hope to be, but how you hope the world to be. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.